Hey everybody, today is Monday, July 17th, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, editor Eddie Hamilton.
McHugh always overwrites scenes so that he can modulate the amount of exposition or the amount of emotion in each sequence. And it's the way that he works because these movies are built around teasing out exactly the right amount of information to the audience when they need it. Here's a story. Tom actually crashed the Fiat into that wall. He wasn't supposed to, but it's incredibly powerful, that car, and really hard to drive. That is one of the secrets to making these movies work as completely as they do.
Yes, all that and so much more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Oh boy, do we have another fun one today, kids. No time to waste because we have fan favorite Eddie Hamilton on the podcast again. You may remember that last year he was on to talk about Top Gun Maverick, the movie that none less than Steven Spielberg said saved the cinema-going experience. Wow. Well, this year Eddie is back with another Tom Cruise joint, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, a story so big they just had to serve it up in 2 pieces. This particular film is the 7th in the venerable action franchise and the 3rd that Eddie has been a part of. His first being Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, and the second being Mission Impossible Fallout. But of course, even before his time in the Tom Cruise extended universe, Eddie was making a name for himself in action film editing. He worked with director Matthew Vaughn on films like Kick-Ass, X-Men First Class, KINGSMAN The Secret Service, and KINGSMAN The Golden Circle. And when I say Eddie has been making a name for himself, that is not just a way to fill 4 seconds of airtime. What I mean is that his body of work speaks loudly, to the point that people with more than a casual interest in editing and action movies not only know the name Eddie Hamilton, they show up to hear what he has to say on editing and making action movies. Maybe that's why you're here today, who knows? But anytime I have Eddie on, or anytime I do an event with him, there is always a lot of positive feedback from the audience about how much they've learned. And I also know that other editors pick up concepts and techniques from hearing Eddie talk as well. So when it comes to all that stuff, I don't know what else I can say about learning from Eddie Hamilton. But there is one thing, and I think it's an important thing. A very important thing, in fact. Because I think it's something we could all embrace and even try and practice. And it has nothing to do with tricks in Media Composer or even editing fundamentals. It has to do with outlook and attitude. When I first met Eddie over a decade ago, and that situation is well documented in the podcast we did about Top Gun Maverick, he was this incredibly enthusiastic editor who was really just getting going in his career. He would joyfully explain what made him want to be an editor and his love of movies as a kid. He would openly express his ambitions, where he wanted to go in his career, the kind of films he hoped to make and the people he hoped to work with, and his desire to join the American Cinema Editors. All the kind of things you might expect to hear from a younger editor with most of their career ahead of them. And now, here he is in 2023, with all these huge movies to his credit, and I'm sure many more blockbusters on the way. And yet he has the same attitude and disposition that he did when I first met him. I can honestly say I have never heard a cynical word come out of his mouth about this business, never a jaded take on the process or the people in his world. Just the same, isn't it great to be here? This is such an incredible job to have outlook. And you might think, well, of course he should be happy to be here. Look at the work he gets to do. Well, it's never that simple. The work is always hard, and the people can be difficult. And the future, as it is for the moment with things like these strikes, is at times uncertain. So you would forgive, if not quite expect, for any editor to display on occasion a calloused disposition about the career, even if they still loved it. Eddie Hamilton, from my viewpoint, has never let the more challenging things about the career of a pro editor tarnish his enthusiasm. Not outwardly, anyway. Everyone starts out their career with hope and ambition and optimism, and to not realize that is certainly sad. But I think what is much worse is realizing that dream and then forgetting to appreciate it. And that's not limited to filmmaking or show business. That's for everything. And to be sure, it is a hard perspective to hold on to. And that is why I say, put aside all the technical wizardry and storytelling prowess. The most important thing to learn from Eddie is to not let go of what made you dream that dream in the first place. All right, before I get even more sentimental, why don't we get on with this show? As I so often do with established franchises, I am not going to spend any real time on the concept of the film or the history of the characters. All you really got to know is it's Tom Cruise, and he's going to do things that make us all break a sweat just watching them, forget actually doing them. So with that idea firmly in mind, let us talk for a minute about how you can use music to get the audience's heart pumping as well. Now, when you think Mission Impossible, besides Tom Cruise jumping a motorcycle off a cliff and then flying and then parachuting towards a speeding train, what do you think of? Of course, it is that incredible Mission Impossible theme. That is the power of great music. And when you need great music, no matter how many death-defying stunts your movie has, you got to go see our friends and Rough Cut sponsor Extreme Music. For over 20 years, they've been providing amazing production audio to content creators throughout the world of media and entertainment. Yes, music created by the top names in music production and composing. Names like Trent Reznor, Michael Giacchino, Quincy Jones, Hans Zimmer, Snoop Dogg, and so many more. All you got to do is visit their website, extrememusic.com, and search on just about every aspect of music you can think of to find the tracks that you need. You can even give them a track and say, hey, Extreme Music, find me something like this. And you know what? They'll do it. Not only that, their impressive catalog of tunes is customizable right down to the instrumentation so that you get the sound that you want in a way that suits your story best. There's no cost to just give it a try, and as far as the licensing goes, you can take care of all that stuff right there online, or they can have one of their reps help guide you through it. So for your next media-making mission, be sure to visit extrememusic.com. And with that, my friends, our adventure in action movie editing is about to begin. Here to lead the way, from Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, is Eddie Hamilton.
It's why we do the job, and I'm thrilled to hear that. That is so exciting. Thank you, Matt.
I'm still disappointed your face isn't on the poster, though, Eddie. You got to work on that. Okay.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
On that note,
let's do it.
It seems like only yesterday that we were talking about Top Gun, and at the time you were working on Dead Reckoning Part 1.
Yes.
It is so hard not to get confused with your schedule when you've been basically working on Tom Cruise movies for the better part of the last decade.
That's true.
When did you actually start working on Dead Reckoning? And between Top Gun Maverick and Dead Reckoning Parts 1 and 2, have you had any breaks?
That's a very good question. So we finished the sound mix on Top Gun at the end of July 2020. And then I had August 2020 off. And then we started Dead Reckoning Part 1. Although, to be fair, we've done about 40% of Part 2 as well. So it's been nearly 3 years since we started. We started in September 2020, and I was there in Norway the day that Tom did the very first jump off the mountain, which was day one of principal photography. And actually, the behind the scenes trailer that was released Christmas last year exclusively in IMAX was an adaptation of a piece that I put together for Paramount Pictures to watch after that first week of filming in Norway. I built a little mini behind the scenes documentary, kind of sizzle reel, and then a fast montage of other bits and pieces that we'd filmed in Norway. But all that stuff with showing off Tom training on the bike and on the skydiving was something which I had built. So that actually, something that I put together that very first week of production ended up being seen by like the rest of the world, like 2 years later in Christmas 2022. We adapted it, obviously, and tightened it and polished it up a bit. But that was one of the very first things I did on the film. And then we worked all the way through 2021 and then all the way through 2022. I had like a week off at Christmas. We had little breaks to edit. So I remember in December 21, I went to New York for a week to work with Chris McCrory. We did the airport scene then pretty much. And then in January 22, I spent 2 weeks in Florida with McHugh, and we edited the train scene, almost that whole kind of third act train. Then we took a break in the summer of 22 and we went to Islesborough in Maine. Chris has a lot of friends there. So I worked there with him for about 4 weeks. We rented a house. We just set up a cutting room in a room of this house. It was literally just my MacBook laptop plugged into a TV, but and a gigantic 160 terabyte hard drive, which is what I carry around with me everywhere. So it came with me and also then after we finished that edit, we went to South Africa and we filmed one of the big action set pieces for Part 2 on these biplanes. So you would have seen a little clip of Tom Cruise that was released on social media. It was in March 22 when he announced that Top Gun Maverick would be playing at CinemaCon in Las Vegas, and he introduced it from the top of a biplane. So we were filming in South Africa at that point. And then we carried on working, and then, oh my word, we had little breaks here and there. And then in 2023, this year, we went to, it was actually, we were all fortunate enough to be nominated for quite a few awards. So I was able to go to the Oscars lunch, which was astonishingly exciting. And I just couldn't breathe for looking around me and seeing who was there. And if you look at the Academy photograph, I was speechless because Steven Spielberg walked over and stood right in front of me for the photograph. And so I was able to say, Steven, hi, I'm the editor on Top Gun. And he was so nice. He said, I've seen it 6 times. I took all my grandchildren to see it. I absolutely loved the film. So that was amazing. And I got to say, I said, look, I'm going to be the 100,000th person you've spoken to who said thank you for the decades of amazing movies that you made. And the amount of pleasure that you've given me in the cinema over the last few decades has been unsurpassed by any other filmmaker. You know, he was so nice and kind. And then we got to go to the Academy Awards, which was, you know, out of this world. And also that month of March, we went to film on an aircraft carrier in the Adriatic Sea on the USS George H.W. Bush. And I went to Svalbard in the Arctic. And we were editing the whole time. So I set up my MacBook Media Composer in the captain's cabin of the aircraft carrier and plugged into the TVs in his cabin and sat and edited with Tom and McHugh. And then literally 2 weeks later, we were in the Arctic in this tiny little house that we rented. And I plugged in my laptop to a TV and we carried on editing. And this 160 terabyte hard drive is being dragged all over the world with me to do all this stuff. And then from April, we kind of stopped work on Dead Reckoning Part 2 and focused exclusively on finishing Part 1. So then it was April 23, May, June. So we finished, you know, about 2 weeks ago in the middle of June. So that was the kind of 2.5-year journey of working on this movie.
That is quite a journey. Hearing you going back and forth on parts 1 and 2, I was reading some interviews with Chris McQuarrie recently, McHugh, as you call him.
Yeah.
A few things he said really stood out. First, he said he admitted he doesn't have an ending for Dead Reckoning Part 2 yet. Hopefully that's not true anymore. But he said basically what you just said, that some of the production was complicated by the fact that you would have to go back and forth between the 2 films.
Yeah.
You'd have to stop working on one to go shoot something for the other.
Yes.
Between that jumping back and forth and his evolution of the script, of the story,
yes,
how does that affect you as an editor and your ability to comfortably make the right editorial decisions for Part 1 when Part 2 is still evolving?
Yeah, it is a challenge. The way that I work is I will sketch out the sequences as they come in, as the dailies arrive in the cutting room with the help of my team breaking down all the footage for me. I'm very thorough with the way that I work with footage. Action sequences, I break down meticulously into short beats of action. So I have all the dailies from every angle so that I can review them very quickly. And I'll put a green marker on one that I think is great or good. And then I'll put 2 green markers, one above the other, on any clip that I think is a dead cert to be in the movie. And so I can start building from the clips that have 2 green markers on them. And if McHugh ever says to me, can we go back and review anything for this tiny piece of action? I have all the stuff lined up. And then for dialogue sequences, we do big line strings, which I know is quite common, where we break down every line of dialogue by every setup. So each setup is on a different video track. So at a glance, you can see how many options you have for each line of dialogue. And if certain lines are covered with certain slates, you can see, you know, where there was coverage on an actor and where there wasn't, and all that kind of interesting stuff. And McHugh always overwrites scenes so that he can modulate the amount of exposition or the amount of emotion in each sequence. And it's the way that he works, because these movies are built around teasing out exactly the right amount of information to the audience when they need it. And also some stuff that we think we don't really need, we'll lift out of a scene, and some of it goes back in because we realize we've overcooked it or over-trimmed it, or something that we thought was insignificant actually turns out to be quite significant in the audience's mind. In this film, it was about communicating to the audience what the antagonist of the movie, this entity, this AI, is up to. And of course, the extraordinary thing is that some of the concepts that we embrace in the film would have been quite hard for an audience to maybe get on board with in January. You know, an AI impersonating the voice of somebody, for example, which is what happens in this film. And of course, now we all just accept it as like the inevitable future which we're kind of weeks away from, at all times. So the fact that Chris and Tom came up with this concept, the erosion of truth, truth is vanishing is what one of the characters says, which, we're all familiar with from the advent of social media. But the fact that AI has become so powerful even now means that this is incredibly timely. But in terms of the question of editing, so I don't worry too much about fine tuning anything in the first stages. My job really is to put a scene up on its feet, knowing full well that it may change a lot. And then McHugh will work on it with me, for a few hours, and we'll refine it. Sometimes we'll work on a scene for a day or 2 days. Very, very, it's microsurgery of really dialing in the emotions and the beats of performance. And the actors are all well aware of this process of the characters and the story evolving as we roll cameras. Hayley Atwell didn't have a dialogue scene for the first 100 days of principal photography. She didn't even know the name of her character. And the irony is that when we did get to film the scene in the library where she first has a conversation with Ethan Hunt, we were at a location in central London and they managed to get the wide shots and then Tom's coverage, and they didn't get Hayley's shots. And then 8 months later, they rebuilt her side of the set and filmed her coverage. And so in a situation like that, all I can do as the editor is cut the scene with Tom's side of the coverage, put in slugs and imagine where I might cut to Hayley. But I am very thorough about going through Tom's coverage and picking what I think is the best stuff. And I will stack up options. That's one of the tricks that I do. If I'm not sure, which delivery I feel is the best, I'll stack up 4 or 5 options so that I can easily switch to another one. But the thing is, I work on the scenes with Chris and we think we've kind of solved the puzzle of the scene. And then, of course, a year later, when we're looking back at what we edited in the context of the film, it needs to be something quite different. And so we'll take another crack at it and recut it again. So that I'm never that attached to what I sketch out to begin with. My job is really to help Chris see something of the scene and see if it kind of sparks an idea or gives him an idea about which way to take the scene. And then we refine it together and keep refining it. And eventually Tom is invited in. Once we've done a few thorough passes, Tom, as the producer, will come in and sit with us and go through the scenes as well and react to them with terrific objectivity. And I know that the process of editing the film, and, one of the things we do as editors is embrace and trust the process, knowing that it's going to start out very average, if not downright poor sometimes when you start to sketch stuff on a timeline. But I never worry about that so much. I always know that, it will improve with work. And ultimately, through the process of editing any movie, you start to discover what's working and what needs to be improved. And so we just chip away at it. But we were working on this movie for, 2.5 years on and off. And we really drilled down on every tiny emotional beat very, very, very carefully over a very long period of time. And when we get feedback from the audience that something isn't working, we will diagnose the problem and figure out a way to solve it, sometimes with pickups, sometimes with restructuring. It's the process of editing. Everyone listening to this podcast will be familiar with this. But the way that Tom and Chris work is we know that everything is evolving, and we know that we're allowing the film to speak to us and we're allowing the characters to speak to us. And we constantly confront the film so that we never settle for anything that's just okay or good. It has to be very good or exceptional. And we really strive all the way through to the end of the final mix with every single note of music and every sound effect and everything. We're striving for excellence all the way through. That's a long way of saying that I don't worry about it too much. And there is a very solid story for Dead Reckoning Part 2, which is amazing. So I'm not worried at all about it not delivering or being emotionally satisfying. I know that what we've set up in Part 1 will all pay off in Part 2 quite deliciously. And I'm sure that what we think Part 2 is now is going to be different when the movie comes out. It's just the process. So I don't worry about it too much.
In terms of organizing everything, is this, in effect, one big film for you, or is it really two films with kind of a firewall between them in terms of organization and also crew?
Well, we have got one crew who've all signed on for the long haul, which is wonderful because they're all terrific. My assistant, my team are great. However, I spoke to some of the team who had worked on Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, and I asked them if they had any tips about working on a Part 1 and a Part 2. And, you know, it's too far back in time for me to call Arthur Schmidt and ask him about how they did Back to the Future 2 and 3 in 1989. And that, astonishingly, was only 6 months apart. And it was all done on 35mm, and it was mag, and it was mixing on reel to reel. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that they managed to do those two movies 6 months apart, given the complexity of all the photochemical visual effects and the split screens, and, you know, Michael J. Fox playing multiple characters, all that stuff that just kind of is mind-blowingly complicated, which they did brilliantly. But I was able to talk to the Harry Potter team, and I got a little glimpse of what it might have been like for the Avengers team doing, you know, Infinity War and Endgame. And initially there was discussion of having, you know, scenes 1 to 500 be part 1 and scenes 501 to 999 be part 2, and have one big media composer project. But in the end, we decided to have two projects and have two sets of scene numbers independently of each other. And the 160 terabyte hard drive I have is almost full of dailies from everything we've shot so far. And there is so many databases and so much media. It's well over 1,000 hours. I think it's like 1,300 hours of footage so far. It's a staggeringly high number. I can give you the exact number if I look at my phone, but therefore the Avid project does take a minute to open now because it's having to scan so much stuff. So what I'm going to do is archive a lot of the part 1 dailies. So I am only focusing on the part 2 dailies just to speed up my media management a little bit. But that's how we broke it down effectively. And so I have a whole separate project. Occasionally, if I'm working on a little sequence for part 2, I'll have a little workshop folder in the part 1 project. So I'll just be working in that so I don't have to switch projects. But generally speaking, we've just stuck with those two projects, and, you know, we switch over, and that's how it's managed.
Hearing you talk about Back to the Future and being shot in 35mm reminded me of this data point from your new film. It's the first Mission Impossible film shot digitally.
Yeah.
How does that affect you as the editor, going from everything I've done so far has been on film and now we're doing this digital? Does that change anything for you?
Well, there is a little bit less discipline on set to stopping the camera, because people can't hear film whirring through the camera. The real reason that we ended up doing it is mostly because of COVID regulations and social distancing and trying to keep the minimum number of people on set. And I know they shot Indy on film, so it wasn't necessarily, but we were one of the very first productions to go back. You know, the moment that lockdown was up, we were in hard pre-production and then rolling cameras shortly after. And also, there are some sequences that have been very challenging to do with film cameras. The sequence in Rome, where Tom and Haley are driving in the little Fiat, they would have 2 or 3 little Z cameras, they're called, with spherical lenses mounted to them. And it would have been difficult to have that many film cameras on that tiny, tiny car. It would have offset the center of gravity quite a bit and made it hard to drive. But really, it was a COVID necessity, I think, ultimately. And I certainly miss film. And I know that Chris McQuarrie is anxious to get back onto film with whatever he does next. But this was just a side effect of where we were and practicalities of filming. And also, when we were in South Africa for 4 or 5 months, there's no film labs nearby. You know, it's very challenging, and we need to be able to look at the footage and download it. And I need to start cutting it together quickly. And, you know, there's nowhere in the Arctic, and there's nowhere on it's like, if we want to work in some of these very remote locations, there's some practicality to that as well, working digitally and being able to just keep the mags safe and then eventually get them back to the lab to download. You know, they're all archived on set, and sometimes we'll even put them on LTOs wherever we are. But we did apply live grain in the DI, so it should feel like it's alive and shot on film ultimately.
While we're talking about cameras, I mean, your last film famously had a ridiculous amount of cameras and footage. I
Yeah.
mean, I think at worst it was like over 20 cameras for stuff shot
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
with the jets,
sometimes.
and then like 1 billion hours of footage.
Oh, so much.
How does Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, at least, compare to Top Gun Maverick? And did you ever just call Chris and go like, what, is this all there is?
I never had that problem. I will be honest with you, because what's great actually about Mission is that there's only one unit rolling cameras at any one time. Chris McQuarrie directs every single shot, as does Chris Nolan, for example, on his films. But, there's no second unit, because Chris really likes to find the compositions and the lenses and direct all the actors. And also he likes to have the actors in his inserts. So you'll notice that in Rome, we only have clean shots of a foot going on a pedal, for example, on an accelerator. In the Fiat, we're always looking up through the pedals towards Tom and Haley. So you've got your A-list actors in the shot, and he likes to have inserts which show the actor holding the item. So we're always over the item looking up towards the actor rather than kind of a clean POV. There are some, but not that many. So that means that there is a manageable amount of footage coming in each day. It's still a lot, but it's not like 6 to 8 hours, which it is on some movies. I think maybe the most we had was like maybe 4 hours. And that was a heavy day. Like on average, it would be, say, 2 hours or sometimes 90 minutes. Sometimes if it was a very light day and they were doing really difficult stunts, which take a long time to reset, we may only get like 40 minutes of footage. That means it's quite manageable in bite-sized chunks day to day. But it does mean that we end up rolling cameras for significantly longer time than a lot of productions. And you've seen the film, Matt, so nearly every sequence is incredibly complicated. They are all very challenging little mini jigsaws to put together, with all kinds of coverage and cross-cutting and keeping characters alive in dialogue scenes, or switching between different locations in the airport or in, where whatever it is. Every sequence is just this intricate, challenging puzzle. Nothing kind of fell together easily, maybe apart from the very first scene where Ethan gets the mission, which was a fairly straightforward scene to build, but everything else was extremely time consuming and required a lot of very specific coverage to tell those stories. And because Tom and McHugh set the quality control threshold at the highest possible level, no detail is too insignificant in every shot of the movie. Even something that's only going to be on screen for a few seconds, or even, less than a second, it will still be a whole setup and everything to get all those shots, which is what happens on these movies. So we did have a lot. We ended up, I think I'm looking at my phone now because I asked the lab to tell me. So on Dead Reckoning Part 1, we did have 781 hours of footage. So it wasn't quite Top Gun's 814 hours, but it's still a lot. That did include maybe 35 hours of camera tests, so which isn't actual dailies. But I had got my muscles had been well and truly flexed on Top Gun, my editing muscles. So that kind of amount of footage was not daunting, especially if you try and stay on top of it on a day-to-day basis, which I do, and I manage to just about, because when you're doing these films, it's such a privilege, and it's such a joy to watch all this amazing footage come in. And you're the first, which I've said to you before, editors are the first person on the planet to see the film come to life in any sort of form when you start to build shots on a timeline for the first time. And you're seeing something which in several years' time will hopefully be being enjoyed by thousands of people in theaters around the world. So I embrace the challenge of working with all that footage. And ultimately, when you've climbed the mountain, it's enormously rewarding to have finished.
Going from Top Gun Maverick to Dead Reckoning, as tight as that is, any new twists and turns to your process or your workflow tools that you're using?
One thing I took from Maverick, which I have embraced wholly on this film. So in Top Gun Maverick, I would color the subclips depending on the character for the aerial scenes. But for the dialogue scenes on the ground, I just stuck to my usual thing of making all the odd numbers green and the even scene numbers blue. But on Dead Reckoning Part 1, because there are some scenes with so many characters, I would ask my team to color the subclips according to the character. And even what's great is on a multicam clip, the two subclips would be colored differently. So if I switched camera from one character to another, I would see that the subclip would change color on the timeline. So I've actually embraced that fully on this film. So you can see at a glance who is talking in a dialogue scene because you can see the color of the clip. So, Ethan has a consistent color all the way through and Grace has a consistent color. And so my team have got a little chart with all the different colors listed out so they know what to make. The other thing that I tried to do and failed ultimately was I tried to use LCR tracks from our sound design team, because if I just asked for 5.1 tracks, you fill up the timeline with 5.1 tracks on Media Composer very quickly and it stops being able to play them all. So I thought, well, look, if I use LCR, I can have twice as many tracks. So the way I would do the LCR is I would basically import it as like a stereo and a mono and then line them up on the tracks next to each other, color the clips the same, and then gang them on the audio mixer so that I would have more options, because then you can have left and center right and the sound team can pan it. And it was really challenging for my team to do that. And I did embrace it for maybe a year of the 2.5 years we worked on the film. But the moment that we got to any kind of temp mix, I jettisoned that and went back to using 5.1 tracks. So I did the kind of Dan Lebenthal method, because I heard him talking about what he does effectively, which is I get 5.1 stems. So we'll get dialogue, some Foley, effects, additional effects, backgrounds, and music. Music I don't really get until the first temp mix, but up until that point, I'm getting all those tracks from the sound team. And what I will do is I will keep those tracks live in the timeline, mute all my temp avid effects, and then slice through the stems where I need to make changes and heal them up. So at all times, I'm working with whatever the current configuration of sound is from the sound team. The great thing about that is that I can evolve the mix on the timeline. So I can add keyframes and adjust certain sound effects to make them louder and adjust the levels of the backgrounds and the Foley. I can work on the dialogue. And if I swap out a take, I just kind of nudge the dialogue to silent on their track and bring up a live mono track above in my dialogue tracks. And the great thing about this is from our first temp mix, we had the same sound mixers. So Chris Burden and Mark Taylor with us, Chris did the dialogues and the music, Mark did the sound effects. The Academy Award winning team from Top Gun Maverick, James Mather was the sound supervisor, the same. So they actually did our first pass on the temp mix. And then all those tracks came in. And then as I was recutting towards the second temp mix, I kept all those mix tracks alive. Wherever I made a change, I would add a marker on the timeline just with a quick note of what I'd done. And then whenever we did a turnover, those markers would be exported for the sound team so that the changes that I had made to their tracks, they would be aware of. So when they were conforming and updating their tracks, they would be able to take the changes that I had made on the Avid Media Composer timeline and incorporate them into the Pro Tools timeline. Then it would continue for Temp Mix 2. I would get all the 5.1 stems from that and then recut, and then Temp Mix 3. And then eventually we'd get the final stems. So that's how we worked on the sound. Is I effectively had live 5.1s. Everything else on the timeline was muted. And then where I needed to step back, I could unmute. The other thing is, if we decided that we preferred something from like Temp Mix 2, I could open those stems and patch them in and make a note. And we could kind of reactivate something that maybe we preferred from an earlier mix. So in a perfect world, I would love an option for Media Composer to have LCR, to have 3.0, 4.0, because composers always work in 4.0. So in their studios, they never have center channel. They never have LFE. They just have left, right, and left surround, right surround. So for them to give us an accurate guide from this music studio, I would love to have 4.0 tracks. And then 5.0, because dialogue never has LFE, Foley never has LFE, but then I would save the two tracks just being full of zeros. So ideally, I would have, mono, stereo, LCR, 4.0, 5.0, 5.1. And then you could like chop and change on the timeline, which I'm sure will come eventually, but can't come soon enough because it would just allow me to not burn through all the 5.1 tracks and fill up the timeline and, run out of Media Composer's ability to play back stuff in real time when a lot of it is just playing back zeros with silence. You understand what I'm saying, but that'll come eventually, I'm sure.
Well, they just had custom track widths go into Pro Tools, so I can't be that much further away. So
Yes, there we go.
I'll give you a sneak preview when I can, Eddie.
Nice.
When we were talking about Mission Impossible Fallout, which seems like 100 years ago, but I think it was like 2018, 2019, you did a great job of really setting up the anatomy, the architecture of an action movie. And you talked about, well, you're going to have this short scene of exposition where you have to set up the goal and the consequences if the protagonist doesn't meet that goal. And then once you've laid that all out for the audience, then you can get into it and just have a really fun big set piece without having to worry about that.
Yes.
Considering the way you're approaching parts 1 and 2, and McHugh saying, well, I haven't quite finished the story for part 2 yet. And also I understand, you're at the mercy of a lot of other things in terms of what you cut and when.
Yeah.
But in general, would it be better to work on those exposition scenes towards the end because of how so much of that stuff is left up in the air towards later on in the process?
That is exactly what we do, Matt, actually. So a lot of the action is filmed first. Everything on location is filmed first. And actually, the reason that happens is it gives the time for the art department to build the sets back in the sound stages. So for the months that they're away filming on location, they can be building some of the more complicated sets. And yes, you're absolutely right. As I said, Hayley Atwell didn't have a dialogue scene till 1 year into production. And that was the first time she even got a hint of her character. The fact that her character was an orphan, the fact that her character had this entire backstory, which is in some ways quite similar to Ethan Hunt's story, which is one of the great things about this movie, is that you're learning about people being recruited into the IMF through Grace's character, which I think is quite delicious in a way. And you've never really seen that in any other movie. So it's a great extra dimension to the mythos of the, IMF, to understand that people are offered a choice and they choose to accept all that cool terminology, which has been sitting there ready to use, but has never been embraced fully in any movie up to this point. But we do shoot all the dialogue scenes right at the end. And sometimes if they don't work, because what Chris does is he makes sure that all the exposition is filmed in small confined spaces, in cars or in the back of a plane or in a safe house set. For example, in Venice, there's quite a few scenes in the Venice safe house, because we can go back on those sets and pick up additional lines of dialogue or rewrite the scene and reshoot the scene to recontextualize what is coming up, which we ended up actually doing for the Venice safe house. So the scene where Ethan and the team are talking about introducing the White Widow, and does she still think you're called John Lark? And didn't she have a price on your head? And then talking about Gabriel's relationship with the entity, and Benji saying, who or what is the most important thing to you? And Benji and Luther talking about source code, which comes into play in the next movie. That scene was like one of the very, very last pieces of exposition we filmed, because the process of screening the movie to audiences and listening to them, we worked out the information they were hungry for at that point in the film. So that is one of the secrets to making these movies work as completely as they do, and making sure the audience is given the information that they're hungry for when they're hungry for it. And again, McHugh overwrites all the scenes so he can modulate how much is actually in the scene when we're editing it. For example, there's a scene in the train car, a small train car, between Gabriel, Isai Morales, and Denninger, who's played by Carrie Elwes. And that had a lot more backstory about the submarine in it, which we ended up taking out because the audience didn't need it. It was kind of clutter. And the whole scene on the train, actually, because it's such a careful balancing act between being with the widow, being with Gabriel and Paris, being with Ethan. There's so many, you're really carefully modulating how much time you're away from each character to make sure that you are just giving the audience enough and not overstaying your welcome, and making sure that they can click back into each story when you rejoin each character. So that, I have to say that was enormously challenging to get the balance exactly right. And we tried hundreds of combinations of different ways of scenes and trimming stuff down and moving stuff here, moving stuff there, which is the nature of the editing process. It's also the fun bit of the editing process, and where you get to really, flex your storytelling muscles. But McHugh and I and Tom work very closely on all that stuff. But to answer your question, yes, we do film all the exposition last for those reasons.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
There's so many great scenes in this film that we could talk about. I know that anybody listening is going to go, how come you didn't ask him about this one? But I thought what we'd do is maybe try and compare and contrast two scenes in particular. The Fiat chase scene in Rome. I mean, that's been all over the trailer and, everybody's seen bits and pieces of that. And you already talked about how there was a change in the camera orientation to really capture that scene better.
Yeah.
So I want to break that one down, but also contrast with something that I think is sneaky difficult that a lot of people wouldn't quite get that, that might have been challenging. And that is the debriefing of the intelligence agencies at the beginning.
Oh, my word. Oh, my word.
Verbal choreography going on there. Like,
yes,
you're in this one room, but you have 7 or so, 8 characters.
Yeah.
It's basically like a script where they're each reading one line from it.
Yes.
So each character is carrying the exposition.
Yes.
And when I was watching that, I thought, this is the kind of scene where nobody's going to notice how difficult, you notice the flashy stuff.
Yeah.
That to me seemed really difficult. So maybe let's start with that one and talk about doing that.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing that McHugh has discovered as a filmmaker, and how he's chosen his lenses and composition and choice of coverage, especially in dialogue scenes. The length of a lens is directly proportional to how intimate the lens is with a character. So if you have a long lens, you're closer to the character. If you have a wide lens, you're further away from the character. And information is the death of emotion, and we are giving the audience an emotional experience. Any movie should be giving the audience an emotional experience. But the wider the lens is, the more information it captures. And the longer the lens is, the more emotion it captures, because the emotion in a movie comes purely from a close-up on someone's face, what someone's face is doing. There is behavior, which is also emotion, and a lot of comedy comes from behavior. But in terms of pure emotion, in terms of like a lightning rod to what a character is feeling, you want to be on a close-up of that character. And you can read the minute pieces of movement of muscles in their face and their eyes and their eyebrows. And you can start to connect with them emotionally. And so you'll notice in this film that there are very few wide shots in the dialogue scenes. McHugh will cover a scene, for example, in the DNI scene, the Department of National Intelligence. You're on a close-up of Cary Elwes, and he's looking out of the window. And if you're on his face, you can see all the characters behind him. So you get the geography of where everyone is standing, but there is an emotional presence from that character in the foreground. So McHugh will cover the scenes with close-ups, but the coverage will be relational. So you will often be over a close-up of one character, and you'll see another character behind. And then later in the scene, you'll be over that other character and you'll be... So, for example, in the scene in the Venice nightclub, in the VIP section upstairs, you could be over Isai Morales to Tom. You can be over Isai Morales to Ilsa. You can be over Ilsa to the widow. You can be over the widow to Grace. So you start to build geography in your mind based on the relationships between the characters rather than on a wide shot necessarily showing you the geography. So quite often, McHugh will choose a very specific moment in a scene to have a wide shot. So in the Department of National Intelligence, the wide shot comes when Kittredge stands up, when we introduce Henry Cerny. We introduce him on the back of his head when he first says his line to give him a kind of mythic presence. And then he stands up and walks over to the TV and clicks the TV. And that's our first wide shot in the scene. And then he walks back over to the room, and through his character, you see the wide shot of the room, and the camera's moving very elegantly. For example, in the airport, when we first meet Benji and Luther, we're playing it on beautiful close-ups of these characters. And the wide shots are based around when something is handed from one character to another. So when the key is passed from one character to another, or when, the lighter, which is the Geiger counter, is passed from one character to another, McHugh will hinge around those essential props and reveal the geography of the characters in space. But the rest of the time, you're on tight emotional close-ups. Not quite Tony Scott close-ups, but they're still kind of very interesting, strong, low, powerful angles of the characters. And McHugh really likes to find the right lens. So he found this close focus 60mm lens that he loved to use. Sometimes it'd be a 75 on certain characters. And so subconsciously, you'll feel like we're on a lot of close-ups, but hopefully you won't lose the geography because you've always got a relationship built in your head between where all the characters are in space. And, geography is king with any sequence, understanding where everybody is.
if you can take a few minutes to talk about how it compares to the Fiat chase sequence. Because again, I almost wonder if you just throw geography out the window, because as these cars are just careening through these narrow alleyways in Italy, well, who cares where they are? I just want the energy.
The interesting thing about that scene is that Ethan and Grace are almost always in a two-shot, because we are selling the idea that they work well as a team and they're a great on-screen couple. Not that it's meant to be romantic. It's just that it's great to see Tom Cruise and Hayley Atwell on screen together. And we're not relying on editing to create chemistry between them, because we're always showing them in a two-shot. The chemistry is palpable. And there's that great scene where the Fiat comes out and he gets in and he's a little bit embarrassed that he's in this car and he doesn't quite know how to work it, because it's like a high-tech IMF car where no buttons are labeled. And, it's very powerful. And here's a story. Tom actually crashed the Fiat into that wall. He wasn't supposed to, but it's incredibly powerful, that car, and really hard to drive. So he did actually crash it. So we embraced that as a piece of behavior. And then 9 months later, after we filmed that crash in Rome, we went and we picked up these close-ups of Ethan and Grace reacting to the crash. And there's that moment where, she's looking at him sympathetically going, it's okay. It's okay. And he's going, oh, I'm sorry. It's the way they set up these cars sometimes. And it's all done in two shots. And Hayley is so great. Even when she's reacting to Tom, she's great. She's so active the whole time. So that's really what you should look out for in that scene is how we cover that without coverage on the two of them. We always play it in two shots. And, there's a lot that we cut out of that scene. Obviously, there always is. And we're making a deleted shots montage for the home entertainment release. So you'll get to see a lot of the stuff that we cut out. It's all good, fun stuff. But we are very sensitive to the audience telling us when something has outstayed its welcome. And even though Tom Cruise is driving a BMW with one hand and he's handcuffed to Hayley Atwell and he's skidding through the streets of Rome and he's knocking over, it's incredible precision driving. He's, knocking over scooters with the back of the car. When the audience is telling us there's too much, then we lift out chunks of it until they're telling us, oh, that was the right amount, or we wanted more. That's ideally what you want the audience to say at the end of an action scene is, I just wanted a bit more of it. But, these movies are a very rich meal and you don't want the audience to eat too much with any course, and we've seen Tom drive BMWs, quite frankly, in other Mission Impossible movies. So even though he hasn't knocked the doors off the car and he's driving with no doors, all that stuff, but the money was the Fiat. And so that was really the most entertaining part of the sequence. So we ended up getting to the Fiat as quickly as we could and then enjoying all the antics that the Fiat gets up to, especially the roll down the Spanish steps, which was something which we were never sure that it would work. McHugh had this idea of driving these cars down the Spanish steps and then having the Hummer smash through and down. And we ended up building the Spanish steps at Longcross Studios so we could smash them up. And actually, at the end of the credit roller, there's even a little thing that says, no cars were driven down the Spanish steps in Rome. They were built on a backlot. Nothing was damaged. But to see that work, the very first time I saw that all cut together and working, and you realize that Ethan and Grace have swapped places in the Fiat, and now she's going to have to drive, and Paris is coming in the Hummer. It's so entertaining and so much fun. And they discovered the spinning Fiat at the bottom of the Spanish steps when they were filming in Rome. I don't believe they necessarily were that popular, spinning the Fiat round, but it's comedy gold, and it's so entertaining and so much fun. And I've sat next to people in this film crying with laughter because it's so entertaining, which is obviously enormously rewarding for the people who made the film to see the audience enjoying the storytelling that much. I was able to put that scene together fairly quickly when it all came together and then refine it with McHugh. And the main challenge was getting it as tight as possible so that literally you're kind of breathlessly watching the whole chase. And just as they get to the end and they're confronted with all the police cars and Paris is coming up behind them and you're thinking, what are they going to do? You feel like, okay, I'm ready for this next chapter. Like it hasn't outstayed its welcome. That was honestly the biggest challenge, Matt, was making sure that the audience always was kind of left wanting a little bit more rather than giving them too much. And we only really cracked it right at the end. We kept holding on to little pieces of behavior and fun. And the audience kept telling us it's still too long, it's still too long. And we literally went through shot by shot going, do we need this? No, let's take it out. Do we need this? No, let's take it out. Does it still work? Does it make sense? If I over trimmed it, do we need to put back in a tiny bit of air? one of the things McHugh is incredibly sensitive to in all these scenes, dialogue scenes or action scenes, is air. And by air, I mean moments where the audience is given even a tiny moment for their mind to wander, where you're feeling like the scene, the dramatic weight in the scene has just slightly overstayed its welcome. And of course, whenever you're editing to begin with, you put in all the dramatic pauses that the actors did on the day, because you just never know. And then the process of editing is compressing everything down to get the maximum amount of story in the minimum amount of screen time. And McHugh, we will go through the scenes and he'll say, I'm feeling air here. And then I'll trim 6 frames off and he'll go, okay, now it's great. Or 8 frames off. And then, of course, you go through the whole movie thinking you've trimmed all the air out. And then you go through it again and you're like, oh no, there's still air here. We can still compress it more. 3 frames off there, 6 frames off there, 2 frames off there. And every editor listening to this will know. But we really do go through the process hundreds of times to make sure that every frame of the movie has earned its place in there. It's exhaustive. And, I never mind doing it, because every time you do it, the movie is changing. So it's evolving and becoming something different to watch. And we would do a lot of Evercast sessions as well on this movie. And Chris McQuarrie would quite often invite his friends in wherever they were in the world, and he would show them scenes and they would sort of sit in and watch for a bit. Like Greg Tarzan Davis, who plays the character of Degas. He's very keen to learn about editing. So sometimes he would log in when he woke up in LA, and he's an early riser. He will get up at 5 o'clock, sometimes 6 o'clock. He'll work out. Then he would join the Evercast and he would listen and watch and just see us going over these 4 lines of dialogue over and over again to really make sure we were wringing every single tiny emotional moment out of it. And every detail of the film is poured over so many times to get it right. But that's the process. And that's what we owe the audience, because we want the audience to have a great time ultimately and not have to worry about all that. Just enjoy the movie. Don't think about all that stuff.
Well, Eddie, per usual, we didn't even get through half the questions I have for you, which is okay, because that means we'll do this again sometime. And I also want to follow your lead and leave the audience wanting a little more. But if you could indulge me for one more final question.
Of course.
One of the people that saw the film, a friend of McHugh's, I'm assuming, is Edgar Wright.
Yes.
Chris has been talking about that Edgar Wright actually had a big impact on the film. He said Edgar came to one of the later screenings and asked a question about an audio cue. And McHugh said, I thought I addressed that one. It was obvious to me, but it wasn't obvious to Edgar.
Correct.
And nobody brought it up until Edgar did. And Chris said it changed the entire movie for the better.
Correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So Edgar came to watch our very first Friends and Family screening. Edgar and a few other filmmakers and a lot of friends. And it was the first time that McHugh and I had ever watched the entire movie from beginning to end, because we'd been working on individual scenes, and he likes to set a date in the diary of when we're going to press play on the movie and work up until that moment. And the movie was long and it had no music, and we took a break after the Venice scene, before the train scene, so everyone could have a pit stop and get some refreshment. So Edgar saw it then, and the main reason for showing it that early is just to see if there are any major red flags story-wise, but there weren't any, so that was great. We knew that we had the potential for a movie that was going to work. We just had to really do the due diligence of compressing it as much as possible. And as I said, there was no music, so it's a very weird, kind of slightly spacey experience watching a movie with literally no score, and sometimes with no sound at all, because the action scenes, we didn't have any sound on. All you could hear if I turned on the dialogue tracks was just, big fans and the noise of wind howling on a microphone, and, it's not anything useful. And then Edgar came to our third Friends and Family screening, which was actually about, I'm going to say, 2 weeks before we finished editing. So I guess it was like maybe 6 or 8 months later. First one was in October 2022. And then this screening, I think, was in early May 23. And he said that the character of the entity, which is the AI, should have some kind of sound effect. And we had underscored it with a music cue originally, which we thought was working, but wasn't really landing for the audience. And I remember I had a feeling that when we're in the VIP room of the nightclub and we see the entity graphic on the big screen, we should hear a very powerful sound, like a kind of bass resonance or something, to indicate that this thing is very powerful, you know, a room shaking, low frequency kind of resonant sound. And we never really got to it. And my idea was only really to have it on those shots. But Edgar suggested that we incorporate it whenever the entity is playing a part in the story, even in the submarine. And even in the airport, when the suspicious baggage alert appears on Benji's laptop, you actually hear the kind of brrr, the digital click sound. So we actually leaned into that enormously, and it became very, very helpful for the audience to identify and feel the presence of the entity in the nightclub, for example, in the submarine, in the airport to an extent. But you don't, you know, it's there when Benji's solving the riddles on the bomb, but it's kind of an early iteration of it. But it's very present when Ethan is being guided to the wrong place by the AI Benji voice. And so you really understand that it's the AI talking to Ethan through the comms, and it's not Benji and Luther. That actually could happen to us. Clearly, like our phones on Waze could be sending us anywhere that we trust the phone, and, you know, we could end up being driven to a trap in some kind of weird Black Mirror style future. But the interesting thing is that we only really landed on that in the last few weeks of the mix. And we were like, what should this sound be? And James Mather went, guys, I've got a great idea. I'm going to play you a sound. And he played us this sound on his phone that was this really alien sounding digital choppy noise, which is what you hear in the film, this kind of sound. And it wasn't like HAL, and it wasn't like other things we'd heard. It was just this kind of weird digital alien distortion. And he said about 2 years ago, this is when he was first contacted about the movie, and he was explained about the concept of this AI. His Sonos soundbar malfunctioned on his home cinema system. And there was some weird, like, HDMI signal discrepancy or some cable that was malfunctioning, whatever. And so this sound was coming through his Sonos soundbar, which was this digital distortion with all this choppiness. And it was really cool. And he got out his phone and he recorded it there and then. He was like, I'm not going to waste this. And then he got a proper microphone and he recorded it. And because he said there might be something in here. And then literally 2 years later, we're on the stage and he goes, hey guys, how about this? And it's perfect. And he recorded about 5 minutes of this. So we had all kinds of different textures and levels of sound. And some of them sounded like a human voice, and some of them sounded like a kind of wild animal. And it had all these different textures in there because he was recording it for such a long time. So we chopped it up and layered it into the movie. And that's what you hear in the film. And as the identity of the antagonist, you know, artificial intelligence. And the stakes for this get much, much higher in the next film, obviously, because the AI grows in power, which it is doing week to week now. We all know that ChatGPT is getting smarter and smarter every week. And so our film will hopefully reflect that.
Well, I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to anybody that once again, you and Tom and McHugh have absolutely knocked it out of the park. You've mastered the art of the action movie. You yourself have firmly entrenched your reputation as the go-to action editor.
That's so kind of you to say, Matt. Thank you so much.
Well, it's the truth. But, you know, maybe next time, maybe a little Nora Ephron kind of thing, okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. Listen, thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for having me on, Matt. It's always a pleasure. I listen every week. I get tips from everybody who's on the show. And it's my pleasure to speak to everyone out there in editing land listening to this, wherever they are, in their car or on a run or in the cutting room watching hours of dailies, which is what I do every Monday when the podcast drops. So thank you very much.
You are the best, Eddie. Yes, that Eddie really is the best. And as far as his new movie goes, it is even better than the hype. A no-doubt action movie classic. I can't imagine how good part 2 is going to be. But for now, we'll just have to wait. Won't you please join me in thanking Professor Hamilton for schooling us on so many things, not only today, but every time we get to catch up with him. You know, Media Composer may not have customizable channel widths in the audio tracks currently, like Eddie wants, but it does have so many, many other very powerful features that Eddie and you can use to tell incredible stories. Your mission, and you better choose to accept it, is to click that link in the show notes that'll take you over to avid.com, where you can see which Media Composer offering is right for you. Hurry, the fate of the world depends on it. All right, maybe not, but it will definitely be good for your career. As far as my career goes, this is a pretty good gig. I just have to hang on to that positive Eddie Hamilton mindset. And you can help with that by giving me your feedback, your ideas, even your critiques. Just knowing that you're out there listening keeps me going. And together we will keep on going. Next week. Or the week after. I don't know. It's summertime, you know. Gotta take a break every now and then. So until we meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.